All right, if you want to go ahead and turn to Acts 19, we're going to pick up there as we continue our survey of really the book of Acts and the period of the early church, the spread of the church as we call it in our Bible periods. And as we look at this in Acts 19, remember that Paul is in the city of Ephesus. And while he's at Ephesus, does anybody remember how long he spends at Ephesus total during this stay? 3 years, that's right. So it's the longest that we know of that he stayed in any one place, at least that we have recorded for us. And remember at the end of 1 Corinthians that he wrote to the brethren there and said that he was going to stay in Asia for a while because he had a door of opportunity that was open to him. And we get an indication of that in chapter 19 and verse 10 where it says that all Asia, not talking about like China and Korea and all those places, but the western part of what is today Turkey, was hearing the word as a result of Paul's work there. I think it's interesting. It may be during this period of time that churches that we don't read about their establishment in the book of Acts, it's when they're going to be established. For example, the church at Colossae, we don't read about its establishment, but Paul talks about the establishment of the church there in Colossians chapter 1, and I think it's very possible that what happened is that people from Colossae or whatever heard the work that was going on at Ephesus, and it kind of spreads out from there. And so we've talked about the fact that the book of Acts is some of the acts of some of the apostles. And so I think we just get a glimpse of the work that's being done here. And if this is happening in lots of other places, which we believe that it was, then you've got this being replicated in lots of other places that we might not even know about. But anyway.
Yeah, so in Acts chapter 19, we've got a lot to cover because we're going to try to get halfway through 2 Corinthians tonight as well. But to set that up, while he's there in Ephesus, he writes 1 Corinthians to deal with some of these problems. Would you say that that was a letter that had potential to make people upset? He was concerned about that too. So in verse 21 of Acts 19, it says, when these things were accomplished, we plugged 1 Corinthians in kind of between verse 20 and 21 there. And he says, when these things were accomplished, Paul purposed in the Spirit, when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. All right, where is Corinth at? What province? Does anybody remember? Achaia. Yeah, Achaia. So he's planning on going there. And so that's his plan right now. So in verse 22, he sent into Macedonia 2 of those who minister him, Timothy and Erastus. But he himself stayed in Asia for a time. Now that great door of opportunity was about to come to a close from the standpoint of problems about to arise. So in verse 23, about that time there arose a great commotion about the way. And we're going to summarize this just a little bit for sake of time. So in Ephesus, of course, Ephesus was a pagan city. And its I guess, most famous and guardian god was Diana. And you had a big trade that went there with all of that. And so people would travel from all over to come to worship Diana. And so there were some of the tradesmen that make the little idols and trinkets and stuff that people would take away. And they're getting upset with Paul. Why would they get upset with Paul? Yeah, so you remember, we saw what amazing public displays of repentance were taking place back in verse 19, that they were bringing magic books and burning them and that type of thing. Well, that type of response was starting to financially hurt their trade of making these little silver idols for them to take to people to buy. And so they get together and they say, hey, look, there's a problem here. Pick up with me, if you will, in verse 25. He called those of the trade together, and they said, men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. Moreover, you see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but also throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned many people away, saying, they are not gods which are made with hands. So that not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. All right, now I want to mention something to you. If you want to get people upset, first hit their pocketbook, and then give them a patriotic or moral reason to be angry at whoever hurt their pocketbook, and you've got a surefire winner there. So the first thing he does is say, hey, this is hurting our business. Second of all, he's defaming our goddess that we're so proud of. And they're like, that's right. And so you see in verse 28, great is Diana of the Ephesians. And this just continues to build until the whole city is drawn into this. And in verse 29, it says the whole city was filled with confusion. They don't really know what's going on, but people are obviously upset here and crying out, great is Diana of the Ephesians. And so with one accord, they seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, who were Paul's traveling companions. So here we learn that some others were with Paul. And they rush into one of the theaters there, the theater there. And it was a large theater. I think Bob Waldron says it could hold over 24,000 people. And so that's a big, they say probably the biggest in the ancient world at that time. And they fill up the theater. The whole town's come together, and they're all upset about this. You want to add to that?
No, so notice verse 32. Now some cried out one thing and some another, for the assembly was in confusion, and most of them did not know why they had come together. So this is not one that is driven by facts or reason. Maybe he started off with some compelling reasons as to why they needed to do something about this. But people will just kind of get swept up in the emotion of the moment, and now they're shouting and crying out, great is Diana of the Ephesians. That's verse 34. Notice at verse 33, they put forward a Jew named Alexander. It seems to me that maybe they don't have, the pagans don't have a clear distinction in their mind between the Jews and the Christians. And so Alexander is going to try to make a defense and try to calm everybody down. And they don't even want to hear it. They're just shouting, great is Artemis or Diana of the Ephesians. And so the town clerk comes, and he would be, I guess, something like the mayor. But he's important because he's going to be the Roman official there. And he gives a list of reasons as to why they need to break this assembly up. First of all, he says, everybody knows about Diana, or everybody knows about Artemis. One's the Greek name, one's the Roman name. But everybody knows about her. There's no need for us to be in such an uproar about these people coming and preaching about some other god. The whole world knows about Artemis. You know, she's going to be okay. Her religion's going to be all right. And he says, the defendants are not guilty, defendants in quotes. Notice that verse 37, you've brought these men here who are neither sacrilegious nor blasphemers of our goddess. Now, I don't know that he has all the facts. I think Paul would say, actually, we are blasphemers of your goddess. We are what you would consider to be sacrilegious. We don't think she's anything. But there's some other compelling reasons why the town clerk wants these people to disband. First of all, he says, verse 39, if you seek anything further, it shall be settled in the regular assembly. In other words, this is an unnecessary way of approaching the issue. There is a court system for you to settle this case. But I think the real reason is verse 40, we are in danger of being charged with rioting today, since there is no cause that we can give to justify the commotion. One thing the Romans hated more than anything else was a riot, especially one that they couldn't put a finger on what the reason was. And so the town clerk is concerned that it's very, very possible that the Romans would come in and put a city like Ephesus under royal lockdown, right, under imperial rule because of a riot like this. And so he dismisses the assembly. So really his reasons are, everybody knows about Diana. The people you've brought here are not guilty. This assembly is unnecessary, but I think the real kicker is, it's dangerous, possibly illegal, and puts us in danger of being under the thumb of Rome.
Interesting side point here. What would you do if you were a Christian and maybe a quite outspoken Christian, and this takes place? What would you do? This is taking place right now. People are swarming, shouting, great is Diana of the Ephesians. What would you do? That's right. I think I'd go home. And you know what Paul wants to do? Can I speak to him? Can I speak to him? What do you think he would say? That's right. He's like, great, I have an opportunity to speak to the whole city at once here. But the brethren didn't think that was a good idea. Some of the city officials didn't think that was a good idea, and so they restrained him from doing so. But I love that. I love that way Paul thinks. You know, Paul's like, this is a fantastic opportunity, and we look at it and go, no, you're going to get killed.
Yeah. So just one other note that I think is helpful is the word assembly that's used in like verse 39 and verse 41 is the very same word that we get the word church from. So in your New Testaments, when you see the word translated church, it's this exact Greek word behind it. So the word assembly or church was a word that simply meant a gathering of people, a common gathering. And so when we think about that word, we shouldn't have in our mind, certainly not a building, but also not some kind of like church structure. Like, so sometimes when people talk about the church, what they mean are the church officials and the organization and all that. What the Bible means by the church is an assembly of people. And it depends on what the purpose is for which they're gathered about what kind of church that is, right? So there are churches of God and churches of Christ, but there are also churches of Diana, obviously. There's an assembly here that's gathered in Diana's name. But that's all it means, is it's an assembly of people. And so as we make our way into chapter 20, verse 1, after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions, he had given them much encouragement, and he came to Greece. Well, Greece is where Corinth is. And so I think there's some question about when exactly 2 Corinthians is written during all of this. One explanation that I think is helpful is that Paul goes to visit them in what we have as Acts 18, right? Somewhere around 51, 52 AD. He hears about their trouble, and so he hears reports and gets a letter from them with some questions. So he writes back the letter that we have as 1 Corinthians. Well, evidently, during this period, maybe what's recorded here in chapter 20, there is a visit to Corinth. So he's going to make reference to a difficult visit in chapter 2. And I think it's possible that then 2 Corinthians is written after that visit. Did I say that right? Does that make sense?
You did say that right. Now, the New King James words it a little differently, and I wonder if some others, because I don't think it's as clear in the New King James that whether that visit had already taken place or whether he's talking about my visit would be difficult.
A future visit.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there are different ideas on what the exact order is. But I do think it's clear that there has at least been some transfer of information that we don't have, especially as you get to the end of 2 Corinthians with these false teachers that have come in. There's a lot of information that Paul has about the Corinthians' response to them that we don't have. And he does look toward another visit, at least, where, regardless of whether he's visited them in the in-between or not, he says, I'm coming again. And if you're not what you ought to be, just be ready for me to bring apostolic authority down on you. So 2 Corinthians, I think in a lot of ways, it fits as a follow-up to 1 Corinthians. There are some questions that I don't know that we can answer definitively about the relationship between the two epistles. But for example, in chapter 2, there's a reference to a man that has been withdrawn from, and now he is coming back, and Paul is encouraging the group there to welcome him back in. Is that the man from chapter 5? I don't think there's anything definitive in the text that says this is that man, but it certainly makes sense in light of what we read in 1 Corinthians 5. And then there are other references to the pain with which he wrote the first letter. And so I think there's a lot of things that will tie us back to that first one. I think 2 Corinthians, as far as all the New Testament books, I think might be one of the least studied, other than maybe Revelation, right? We reach Jude and make a U-turn back and get out of there as quick as we can. But 2 Corinthians, at least of the Pauline epistles, I think is sometimes a neglected book. And maybe it's because of the very special circumstances that it's written into, but I think there's a lot of really good application in the book.
Yeah. Any comments or thoughts before we get into 2 Corinthians? Yeah, Paul definitely did not have fear. And just a side note, so we need to move on, but it is interesting that even though Paul, as you said, every occasion we see him acting so boldly, and yet we see him struggling with that in his epistles, because he writes to them and he says, pray that I'll speak as I ought to and that I'll be bold. So I think that that's interesting. We see him succeeding in that, but we know from his writings that he struggled with that as well. Anything else before we get into the letter? All right, so we'll have to summarize greatly. We would like to get through chapter 7. That would be a nice stopping point and a nice break there. So in chapter 1, Paul writes this, and you notice that he says, he starts off just like he always does, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother. So Timothy's with him. putting these together, we see that Timothy had been sent on ahead of Paul. And we don't have our map up here, but it appears that what Paul did is he intended to go to Corinth first, but he doesn't go to Corinth first. He leaves and he goes up to Troas, and he's going to wait in Troas for Titus, hoping to hear, because it seems Titus took the first letter, and he wants to hear how did they receive the first letter. He's anxious about that. He doesn't find Titus, and so then he goes on into Macedonia. Then he finds Titus, and he gets some really relieving news that they received the letter pretty well. But then he also got some troubling news. There's some problems there, and there's some people trying to discredit you. But he runs into Timothy there apparently too, because Timothy is mentioned here in this greeting also, that Timothy's with him. And so he's writing to the church of God at Corinth with all the saints who are in Achaia. And he starts off in these first verses 3 through 7. There's a word that stands out. Anybody, when you were reading this, did anybody notice a word that really jumped out at you in those verses? Comfort. 10 times, I believe it's mentioned. Comfort, comfort. We've been comforted. And here's this mixture of we've been suffering and yet we're comforted. He's been suffering greatly, and he's going to explain that a little bit. But the comfort that he has is coming from the news that he's receiving, and then also the comfort that comes from Christ. And he's saying, you've comforted me, and I'm able to comfort you. And that's what he's intending. That idea is going to come up a lot in this epistle, this idea of comfort in the midst of tribulation or in difficulties.
Yeah, and you might see the word affliction and sufferings almost as many times as the word comfort is in those sections. And I think that part of the affliction might have been the strained relationship that existed between the Corinthians and Paul. And that's going to come up especially like in chapters 10 and on. But in chapters 1 through 7, I think what Paul is really trying to do is bridge that gap that has been created by the Corinthians. And he's going to say, I didn't create this gap. You did. And so as we make our way to the second part of this, he says, our boast is this, the testimony of this in verse 12, of our conscience, that we behaved in the world with simplicity and godly sincerity, not by earthly wisdom, but by the grace of God, and supremely so toward you. For we are not writing to you anything other than what you read and understand, and I hope you will fully understand, just as you did partially understand us, that on the day of our Lord Jesus, you will boast of us as we will boast of you. He's saying, I didn't come to you. So evidently what's happened is there have been some guys who have come into Corinth who are helping to pull the hearts of the Corinthians away from Paul. And Paul reminds them, he says, I didn't come to you with flash or with pomp and circumstance. I came to you with grace. And we boast in you. You know, it seems we are proud of you. And he says, and I know that when the day of the Lord appears, you'll be proud of us too, because of the work that we've been able to do together. So he's doing everything he can in 2 Corinthians, I think, to pull back together, to reconcile the relationship between himself and the Corinthians, even though, and this is maybe the most beautiful thing about it, it's their fault that the relationship is strained. And yet Paul's the one who's reaching across and trying to bring them back.
It seems one of the criticisms that have been leveled against Paul is, you know, he's just so fickle. He said he was coming to visit us, and then he didn't come visit us when he said he was going to. And so you have this in verse 15. He said, in this confidence I intended to come to you before that I might have a second benefit, to pass by way of you to Macedonia, and to come again from Macedonia to you, to be helped by you on your way to Judea. And somebody said, yeah, and he didn't do that, so you can't believe what he says. You can't trust him. And so he's going to explain why. First of all, he says, I'm not playing games with you. I'm not just saying something lightly. I fully intended to do that. But then look at verse 23. Moreover, I call God as my witness against my soul, that to spare you I came no more to Corinth. In other words, he in chapter 2, verse 1, I determined this within myself, that I would not come again to you in sorrow. Well, what would make him come in sorrow? They didn't repent. And so he was waiting. He sent that first letter, and he knew that if he came right after that first letter, that there could be more conflict between them. And so he wanted to give them time to kind of digest that and to make corrections there, so that he could come and say, y'all did really well, rather than, hey, y'all are not doing well. And so he said, that's the reason I changed my plan. So whoever was making criticisms of, well, you can't trust him because he just changed his plans, he said, no, I didn't change my plans lightly. I changed it for an intended purpose.
So you see as we continue on in chapter 2, and maybe this is a good place to pause and say, anybody have any thoughts or questions through this? So I think maybe where I think it is right that I think he probably has not seen them since he wrote that first letter. The way the English Standard renders verse 1 is, I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you. Is that yours says, does not say another painful visit?
Yeah, I would not come to you again in sorrow.
Again in sorrow. So
Yeah.
I think that's probably taking the first visit when the church was established as the
That's the way
original
I've
case.
taken it.
And so make another painful visit almost indicates that there's been one painful visit in the interim. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Okay. If it doesn't, don't worry about it, because I think the point is he doesn't want to come to them in a painful way. He wants to come to them in joy. And that first letter, because of the criticism that he was, and the constructive criticism that he was giving them, it could have been difficult. And so notice as he goes on, he says, for if I have caused you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? I think his point is, I'm not taking any joy in this, because if I cause you pain, you are the people who have been consoling to me in so many instances. And so if you're in pain, then I don't have anybody to bring me consolation. And I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. For I felt sure of all of you, that my joy would be the joy of you all. For I wrote to you out of much affliction and anguish of heart, and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. I think this is a great book when we're trying to talk to somebody who's in maybe in a sinful condition, and we're trying to reach out, and every advance that we make for trying to make correction, they take as us being angry or us being hateful or us being malicious to them. And I think Paul's words here show, first of all, that you can have the best of intentions and on the other end it not be received in the best way. But what do we do when that happens? Make every effort to say, listen, the reason I'm doing this is not because I want to cause you pain, but because of the abundant love that I have for you. That's why I did that, because I want us to be able to have that joy of fellowship. And that's not the way our relationship can be as long as this stands in between us.
Larson made mention of, he says, I didn't want to come right away because I wanted to give you time to make corrections there. And one of the corrections, I think Larson was right, that it appears to me that this would be the correction of the man who had his father's wife in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. And he said, remember, what punishment were they inflicting on him at the time that he wrote 1 Corinthians? None. And so he says, I'm telling you, as if I was there, you need to withdraw from this individual. So in verse 6, he says, the punishment which was inflicted by the majority was sufficient for such a man. What does that sound like happened? It sounds like they took action, and what was the result? He repented. Wow, that's exactly what you want. So what happens when you say, okay, we're not even going to eat with such a one? That's what Paul said. We're going to deliver him over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. And we're not even going to eat with such a one. And now he repents. What do? Well, we're not going to eat with such a one. No. The purpose was to deliver his body for the destruction of the flesh, that his soul may be saved. And if he repented, then what you need to do is you need to comfort him and strengthen him and welcome him back. Because what happens if you don't? Oh, that just gives Satan an opportunity to get at him again. And so you want to rally around him and support him in that which is correct. And so Paul gives some instruction there through verse 11 on that. And he says in verse 11, lest Satan should take advantage of us. We're not ignorant of his devices. We know that Satan preys upon those who are isolated from other brethren. So if this man's repented, support him and encourage him.
So in verse 12, notice he says, when I came to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ, even though a door was open for me in the Lord, my spirit was not at rest because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I took leave of them and went on to Macedonia. Now, why is he waiting on Titus? Yeah, he wants to find out about the condition of the church at Corinth. It's kind of like when he sent Timothy to Thessalonica, he sent Titus on to Corinth. Now, we'll learn more about that in chapter 7. But notice that he says, there was an opportunity for me to preach in Troas, but I was so concerned about you that my spirit couldn't rest, and I had to make my way over to Macedonia in order to find Titus. And I think what he's showing to the Corinthians is, my concern for you goes to the extent that I'm willing to give up other opportunities because of how much I care about you. And so I think he's wanting them to see, no, I'm not just blowing you off for other things. I'm not just, kind of not keeping my word because I've got better opportunities or greener pastures. I really care about you to the point that I'm foregoing opportunities in order to find out about your well-being.
All right, so something interesting happens here in this letter that is not unusual for Paul. But you look at chapter 2 and probably verse 13, maybe verse 14, right in there. He's talking about, okay, so I was trying to find out how things were going. I was waiting for Titus. I didn't find him in Troas, so I went to Macedonia. And then there's a parenthesis. Imagine in your mind there's a parenthesis because he's about to shift gears and talk about something else that's related to that. And that end of that parenthesis is not going to come till chapter 7, verse 5. And so you're going to have the next several chapters where Paul just takes a little detour. He's talking about, I was anxious for you. I was waiting to hear from Titus. And then he starts talking about, let me tell you something about why I'm anxious about you, what type of person I am, the type of service that I do in God's kingdom. And so for the next several chapters, he's going to talk about his ministry in the gospel, and his motives and his methods and what the gospel is and how he's been entrusted with this. And that's important for them to know because somebody in Corinth is throwing some serious shade on Paul's reputation as a minister of the gospel. And so he's answering this criticism and in the way he can. But we're going to pick up with that idea of him trying to talk to Titus and find out how they're doing. But beforehand, he's going to talk about his method. Now, notice verse 17. This will be a good jumping off point as we get into chapter 3. We are not as so many peddling the word of God, but as of sincerity. But as from God, we speak in the sight of God in Christ. And so we're genuine and sincere. We're not trying to make a living out of this. We're not trying to pat our pockets with this. We sincerely care about you and care about the message. And that's the reason why we're doing this.
So notice in chapter 3, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you from you? Why does somebody need a letter of recommendation? They don't know them, right? So if you're applying for a job or I think there are examples of letters of recommendation for congregations. They sent with Apollos a letter recommending him to the group because they don't know him. Why would it be ridiculous for the Corinthians needing a letter of recommendation from Paul? He established the congregation there. And notice, I love what he says there. Verse 2, you yourselves are our letter of recommendation. He's like, if somebody wanted to know about us and didn't know about us, we would just show them you. You're our letter of recommendation, written not with ink and paper, but on human hearts. And I think he's referencing passages like Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36 in the Old Testament that talked about these new covenant people who would be transformed from the inside out because God's law would be written on their hearts. And he says, and you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of living God, not on tables of stone, but on tables of human hearts. The point is that our letter of recommendation is the lives that you're living that demonstrate the power of the preaching that we brought when we came and preached to you the first time. You're our letter of recommendation. And that's going to open up a whole new conversation about the difference in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. And an illustration of this passage in chapter 3, I remember Brother Bill Hall talking about, he's like, have you ever driven on a road, maybe in the middle of the night, like if you're traveling somewhere, and the full moon is just so bright that you almost don't need headlights. Now, you don't test it out and turn off your headlights, but you can almost imagine that you could just see without them. And if you're driving and you drive through the night and on into the morning, and then the sun comes up, well, all of a sudden that moon didn't seem so bright anymore, right? The sun is it's not that the moon wasn't radiant. It's not that it wasn't glorious. But in comparison with the morning sun, it pales in comparison. And I think that's exactly what he says about the relationship between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. It is not that the Old Covenant was bad. It is not that it was glorious. It was beautiful. But it wasn't the sun shining. It wasn't the New Covenant that has come.
So he makes this point. He says, all right, you're our letter of recommendation. But verse 5, not that we're sufficient of ourselves to think anything as being of ourselves, but our sufficiency comes from God. You're our letter of recommendation. What do you do in a letter of recommendation?
Talk about yourself.
Say, hey, I'm pretty good. That's why I should be hired for this job, right? He says, no, that's not the case. It's not casting, not giving glory to us, but our sufficiency is from God. And then here's the verse that ties into what Larson was saying. Who made us sufficient as ministers of what? Of the new covenant. All right, now this is what makes their ministry so special, is that it's of the new covenant. And as Larson was saying, it's so much better than the old covenant. And he uses an illustration from the Old Testament. Do you remember when Moses came down off the mountain from talking with God? What was his face doing? Ooh, it was glowing, right? Why was it glowing? He had been in the presence of God. But what happened to it after he'd been off the mountain for a while? It faded. It faded. And he would actually cover it so that they couldn't see that it was fading. And then when he went back up on the mountain, it would glow again. All right? And Paul says, that's what's happening with the old covenant. The old covenant was glorious, but it fades. But the new covenant, guess what? It's even more glorious. And you know what? It doesn't fade. And so he makes the point, he says, we're kind of like Moses in that our faces are glowing from the glory of this new covenant, but we never have to cover it. We never have to veil our faces because it just continues to glow more and more, and we're more and more like Christ. That's what the new covenant is. And so he's talking about his ministry, and he says, this is why my ministry is so great. Not because of me, but because God entrusted me with the ministry of a new covenant, which is so much better than that old covenant that was glorious.
Yeah, and there's a fascinating aspect of this, which is, but not everybody sees the glory. Like, why do they not see it? And in part, his argument is when Moses covered his face, I think this is the argument that he's making, is his face faded, and they never saw the fading part, right? They saw the shining part, but they didn't see the fade. And so what ends up happening is that they still have a veil over their heart. They don't see that it has been rendered ineffective. They don't see that it has been brought to an end. And so what happens, yes, verse 15, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. So imagine reading the Old Testament and not seeing Christ there. It would be like having a veil over your heart. It would be like having a curtain over the Old Testament. You wouldn't be able to see the full glory and beauty. And so the glory that is actually there would be muted, right? Because even the glory of the Old Covenant is less when you don't see it as pointing forward. But verse 16, but when one turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. So when somebody comes to Christ and they see Him and His glory, then all of a sudden you can look at Moses and what he wrote, and it shines with an even more radiant glory because you see that which it's pointing to the whole time. And so under the new covenant, what we actually do as we read about Christ and as we look at Him, we are able to gaze on the glory of the Lord. And so this is verse 18. We all with unveiled face beholding the glory of the Lord are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. I think the idea is this, is that as we look at Christ in the Scriptures, through the preaching of the apostles, we behold the glory of God, not in the face of Moses, but directly, right? We see the glory of the Father made known in the Son. And as we look at that, what happens to us? We're transformed to look more like that. We are being shaped from one degree of glory to another, being conformed to His image. And I think the idea there is that's how the gospel works, is that we see Christ and we see His word and we see His teachings and we see His character. And as we gaze upon that and meditate on it, ourselves are changed little by little to become more and more like the one that we're studying about. And I think that's his argument as to why is what they have so special? Because it's not just another religion in the sense of just another list of... It's transformative. It changes people from the inside out. And I don't use religion there disparagingly. I just mean it's not just another system or set of rules or something like that. So in chapter 4, he's going to talk about the precious value of what they're preaching, and that it's valuable not because of who he is, not because of the preachers, but because of the message itself. Anything? Yeah, go ahead.
So if you've got a product, let's say you're a salesman, and you've got a product that is just outstanding. How great of a salesman, how many gimmicks do you have to use? Well, if you order right now, we'll throw in. You don't have to do that. All you do is say, hey, look, this is what I've got. You need this? And it's like, yes, I need that. So here's what Paul says. Because we have such a wonderful message, verse 1 of chapter 4, therefore, since we have this ministry, as we have received mercy, we do not lose heart. We have renounced the hidden things of shame, not walking in craftiness, nor handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. Look at verse 5. We do not preach ourselves, but Christ Jesus the Lord, and ourselves your servants for Jesus' sake. And there are apparently some teachers in Corinth that are really promoting themselves, and their methods are not all upright. And Paul is saying, we're ministers of the gospel. We don't need to use those tactics. And so he's saying, you ought to know me. I've been there. I mean, you're my epistle. You're my letter of recommendation. You know the way I operate. And I operate the way that I do because of the glorious message that God's given.
So notice verses 4 through 6. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, light shine out of darkness, has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. So by proclaiming the gospel, the glory of Jesus is being displayed, and that light is able to shine. Now notice this in verse 7. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. So it's like having a beautiful rose in a very modest vase. It draws the attention to the thing that it's containing. If you had just some kind of antique or artistic vase, it would draw your attention away. He says, you think about the Galilean fishermen and the tax collectors and all these people who are the ones who are chosen to carry the message in order to highlight the beauty of the message and to show that the people being converted and transformed is not because of the smoothness or the cleverness of the people preaching, but because of the power of the message. In fact, he goes on to say, we're afflicted, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. In fact, if you looked at the shell that is carrying this message, you would be unimpressed, afflicted, crushed, perplexed, given over to death. But what's the point of all that? So that it would produce life in the people who see and hear and respond to the message.
Have you ever noticed that a lot of these big TV evangelists, what kind of cars they're chauffeured around in? You ever notice what kind of suits they wear? How they have their private planes in their mansions? Besides just them maybe enjoying that, do you know why that's done? People are attracted to what looks like success. And part of their message is, hey, listen, if you'll follow me, you can have this same type of success. Is that the way that Paul approached the gospel? So he's saying, look, we're in earthen vessels. We're being persecuted. Our bodies are being torn down all the time. And I think that part of maybe what was going on in Corinth was somebody was saying, I don't know that Paul's really all of that. I mean, look at him. He's, and look at the way he's treated. I don't know that he's a success. And so Paul is making a defense. The gospel, it's not me. And as a matter of fact, if it was me, you'd have nothing. You have the gospel. And so, yes, my body's being torn down. Yes, I'm nothing to look at. Yes, but the gospel is something. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that, how do you feel when your body's being, well, I'm not a billionaire. I don't have a nice car. I don't have great health. I don't look real handsome. How do you feel about all that when you have the message of the gospel? that's okay. Because, and he makes this point in verse 17, our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. We're not worried about the seen. We're looking for what is unseen. And so he's making this transition. Somebody was saying, you can look, and by what's seen, you can tell how successful someone is spiritually. And Paul says, no, that's not the way that works.
Yeah, and so as he moves into chapter 5, he says, well, what are the things that are unseen and eternal to which we look that keeps us from losing heart? And so he says at the beginning, we know that if this earthly tent is destroyed, we have a building from God eternal in the heavens. That's the thing we're looking towards. And so he says, verse 5, he who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. And I would tie that back to the preaching of the gospel that we saw in chapter 3 and 4 that transforms them from the inside out. That assurance comes from like passages like Romans chapter 8 and verse 16, where it talks about the fact that His Spirit testifies with our spirit that we're children of God. How is the Spirit given to us as a guarantee? It's in the sense that when we read what is revealed in the gospel, and we know that we have submitted to that we have this assurance that God who has given us salvation will also finish the job and give us a home in heaven. And so the Spirit is like a down payment of that promise that's coming. So he says, verse 6, so we are always of good courage. Really? Right? Perplexed, crushed, afflicted, and you're going to always be, because we know that while we're at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. We know that here we're just in a temporary residency, and as long as we're in this corruptible body, we're not where we want to be. For we walk by faith and not by sight. Yes, we are of good courage and would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So the worse I suffer here, in some senses, the quicker I'm going to be there with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, that is from the Lord, whether we're in this body or not, we make it our aim to please Him. For we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each man may receive what is due for what is done in the body, whether good or evil. How foolish it would be to live only with this tent in view, when we know that we're all going to have to stand before the judgment seat of Christ. So Paul says, we don't worry primarily about what happens to this body. Our ambition, our aim, we make it our goal to please the Lord, because we know we're going to have to stand before Him in judgment. And so you even move into verse 11. Therefore, knowing the fear of the Lord, we persuade others, but what we are is known to God, and I hope it is also known to your conscience. Knowing the terror of what will come for somebody who is not prepared to face that judgment seat. Not only are we trying to please the Lord, but we're trying to persuade others to be what they need to be as well.
So verse 20 and 21. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. As though God were pleading through us, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. And he said, that's our message. That's how we feel towards you. That's our whole aim. Our aim is not to get rich off of you. Our aim is not to make you our servants. Our aim is to cause you to be reconciled to God. And we gladly suffer all of this so that that glorious message can be imparted to you and you can be reconciled to God. So verse 1 of chapter 6, we then, as workers together with Him, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain.
All right. Anything through the very beginning of chapter 6 that you would like to say? I don't think we can get much further into it. So let me just make a note about 2 Corinthians 5, verse 14. This is a powerful passage. It's really helped me. For the love of Christ controls us, because we have concluded this, that one has died for all, therefore all have died. And He died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for Him who for their sake died and was raised. What is it that ultimately compels us to obey God? I think in seeing that Christ, the King, the Lord, died for us, that love is strong enough to compel us, to control us, to constrain us. We look at Him and we say, if He died for us, then we no longer need to live for ourselves, but for Him who died for our sakes and was raised. And that is the message that he talks about in 2 Corinthians, that the Spirit writes on our hearts. I think that's the compelling thing about the gospel that was missing from the old law. It's not that the law was ineffectual. It's not that the law was not glorious. It's not that it wasn't powerful. but it's in the gospel that we see the love of Christ demonstrated in such a way that our hearts are transformed, that we can have that full and real forgiveness that comes from what He did for us. And I think that's part of what works to transform our hearts. So it's not that people in the Old Testament weren't forgiven. I think there's lots of passages that I think David says, "Blessed is the man whose sin is forgiven." But we see what that cost so much more clearly now. That God took Him, verse 20, who knew no sin, verse 21, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, that we might be the righteousness of God through Him. To see what that cost, and to see the sacrifice that took, it compels us to respond in love for Him and obedience to Him. And I think that's what he's trying to compel the Corinthians to do, is not only see Paul's love for them, but to see God's love for them, and that's what's the important thing, and so that they need to pursue reconciliation with God.
All right. Do you all have any thoughts or comments? Thank y'all for being so attentive and so patient through. We just had to push tonight, but we have a moment. Anybody have anything they'd like to add? All right. Well, we will pick up in the latter part of chapter 6 next time and conclude this section about his ministry and what he's trying to accomplish. And then we'll look at some instruction and some topics that he's going to deal with as we get on through. And Lord willing, we'll finish 2 Corinthians next class. Thank you for your good attention.
Thank you all.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.